A homeless Navy SEAL bought a dying boat for $1,000. Then his dog uncovered a secret hidden for 50 years. Mason Cole had lost almost everything: home, stability, and the future he once imagined. Living from an aging pickup truck beside his loyal German shepherd, Shadow, the former Navy SEAL spent his last $1,000 on a rotting boat everyone else wanted scrapped. But when Shadow uncovered a hidden clue beneath the floorboards, they awakened a forgotten wartime secret that would change lives, heal old wounds, and reveal a hero no one had remembered. Comment 1 if you'd keep searching for the truth no matter how long it takes, or 0 if you think some secrets should stay buried. And tell us where you're watching from. Winter had settled over Black Pine, Montana, like a heavy gray blanket. Snow clung to the peaks surrounding the valley. Pine trees stood motionless beneath a sky the color of cold steel. The lake at the edge of town reflected the mountains like a sheet of dark glass, beautiful and unforgiving at the same time. Most people were indoors, warm, safe, home. Mason Cole had none of those things. His home was a faded blue pickup truck parked behind an abandoned feed store at the edge of town. The truck was nearly 20 years old. Rust lined the wheel wells. The heater barely worked. One headlight had been held together with duct tape for so long, it looked permanent. Inside, beneath several army blankets, Mason opened his eyes. The nightmare had come again. His breathing was ragged. His hands shook. For several seconds, he wasn't in Montana. He was somewhere else, somewhere hot, somewhere loud. The sound of rotor blades echoed inside his head. A radio crackled. Someone shouted. Then silence. The kind of silence that only comes after something terrible. Mason sat upright. Sweat covered his forehead despite the freezing air. Beside him, a large German shepherd immediately lifted his head. Shadow. The dog moved closer without hesitation. His intelligent brown eyes watched Mason carefully. Not judging, not questioning, just there. Like always. Mason reached down and rested a hand on the dog's neck. The thick fur felt warm, real, grounding. Slowly, his breathing steadied. "Bad one," he whispered. Shadow nudged his hand. The dog had done that hundreds of times over the years, maybe thousands. Ever since they left the military. Ever since life had become something Mason no longer fully understood. Outside, dawn was beginning to paint the mountains with pale blue light. Another day. Another chance to survive. Mason climbed from the truck and immediately felt the bitter cold bite through his jacket. Shadow jumped down beside him. The dog's muzzle was beginning to gray with age. So was Mason. 43 years old, former Navy SEAL, decorated veteran, homeless. Life had a strange sense of humor. Years ago, he had led missions in places most Americans would never hear about. Now he spent his mornings searching for enough work to buy coffee and dog food. His construction job had disappeared 6 months earlier. The company closed. After that, everything fell apart quickly. Savings vanished. The apartment disappeared. Friends became distant. The world moved on. Only Shadow stayed. Shadow always stayed. Mason opened a plastic container and poured the last handful of kibble into a bowl. The dog ate slowly. Mason stared into the nearly empty bag. There wasn't enough left for tomorrow. He looked at the worn wallet in his pocket. $1,000. That was it. Everything he owned. The final remains of a life that had once looked very different. Most people would spend it on rent, food, gas, survival. Mason knew that. But lately something strange had been happening. Every afternoon he found himself walking toward Black Pine Lake, toward the marina, toward an old boat. He couldn't explain why. The boat should have meant nothing, yet somehow it didn't. The marina sat on the far side of town, where weather-beaten docks stretched into the dark water. Most of the boats were working vessels, fishing boats, tour boats, small recreational craft. But one vessel sat alone near the end of the yard. Forgotten, abandoned, waiting. Its hull was scarred and faded, paint peeled away in long strips. Sections of wood had rotted. Rust covered the fittings. The nameplate was gone. The boat looked less like transportation and more like a ghost. Mason had noticed it weeks ago. Every time he passed it, he slowed down. Every time he looked away, something pulled his attention back. Even now, standing in the snow with Shadow beside him, he felt the same strange tug. An older marina worker named Earl spotted him. "You again?" Earl called. Mason smiled faintly. "Guess so." Earl shook his head. "Most folks don't look twice at that thing." Mason studied the vessel. What happened to it? Nobody really knows. Nobody? Owner disappeared decades ago. Paperwork got lost. Boat got shuffled around from yard to yard. Been sitting here forever. Mason walked closer. Shadow followed. The German Shepherd sniffed the frozen ground around the trailer. The boat seemed larger up close. Military almost. Utilitarian. Built for work rather than comfort. Mason ran a hand along the weathered hull. Something about the shape felt familiar. Not familiar enough to identify. Just enough to bother him. "She's headed for scrap next month," Earl said. Mason looked up. "Scrap?" "Developer bought part of the marina. Wants the lot cleaned up." Mason frowned. The words hit harder than expected. Scrap. Finished. Forgotten. Disposed of. For some reason, the idea bothered him. A lot. Earl noticed. "You're not thinking about buying it, are you?" Mason laughed quietly. "With what money?" Good point. But the thought had already entered his mind. And once it entered, it refused to leave. The following days passed slowly. Mason picked up odd jobs, shoveled snow, stacked firewood, helped unload supply trucks. Every evening he returned to the marina. Every evening he stared at the boat. Shadow always came with him. Always. Then one afternoon, something happened. A group of local teenagers walked past. One pointed toward Mason. "That's the guy living in his truck." Another laughed. "Looks like he's adopting junk boats now." Their laughter echoed across the marina. Mason ignored them. Years ago, words like that would have angered him. Now they mostly made him tired. Still, the comments lingered. Not because they hurt, because they weren't entirely wrong. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe buying that boat would be foolish. Maybe it made no sense. But then again, neither had Shadow. Years earlier, after a difficult deployment, the military had planned to retire the aging K9. Most people would have moved on. Mason didn't. He fought for the dog, adopted him, kept him, even when it complicated everything. Especially then. Some things couldn't be explained logically. They just felt right. 3 days later, Mason made his decision. The marina office smelled like old coffee and damp wood. Earl looked up when Mason entered. "Back again?" Mason nodded. "I want the boat." The older man stared. "You serious?" "Yeah. You know it's a wreck." "I know. You know it'll take everything you've got." "I know." Earl leaned back. For a moment he seemed genuinely concerned. "Son, people usually spend their last $1,000 trying to stay alive." Mason glanced through the window toward the lake, toward the boat, toward something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe this is me trying to stay alive. Silence filled the office. Finally, Earl nodded. An hour later, the paperwork was complete. The boat belonged to Mason Cole. His final $1,000 was gone. Every cent. When he walked outside, snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. Shadow stood waiting beside the trailer. The dog tilted his head. Mason laughed softly. "We officially own a pile of junk." Shadow wagged his tail. For the first time in months, Mason smiled. A real smile. Not because life was fixed, not because his problems were gone, but because for the first time in a long time, tomorrow felt different. That evening, he climbed onto the boat and sat alone as darkness settled over Black Pine Lake. The mountains became shadows. The water became black glass. The town lights flickered in the distance. Shadow curled beside him. Together they listened to the wind moving through the pines. Mason ran a hand along the damaged railing. The wood felt cold beneath his fingers. Then he noticed something. Near the stern, almost hidden beneath layers of peeling paint. A marking. Faint. Nearly invisible. Not a boat registration number. Not a manufacturer logo. Something else. Something older. Something military. His pulse quickened. Mason leaned closer. The symbol was worn beyond recognition, but it was enough. Enough to raise questions. Enough to keep him awake. Enough to make him wonder if buying the boat had not been a mistake after all. Far across the lake, hidden among the trees, a single cabin light glowed in the darkness. And inside that cabin, an old man named Russell Granger was about to learn that a ghost from his past had finally come home. Russell sat alone beside a cast-iron stove, watching snow drift past the window. The cabin overlooked Black Pine Lake from a ridge surrounded by towering evergreens. Most people in town rarely saw him. Fewer still knew anything about his past. That was how he preferred it. At 79, silence had become a companion. The old veteran slowly stirred a cup of coffee while an ancient radio played softly in the background. Outside, the wind rattled the branches. Inside, the walls held photographs few visitors had ever seen. Black and white pictures. Young men smiling. Military uniforms. Boats. Water. Memories. The kind that never completely faded. Russell's eyes drifted toward one particular photograph hanging near the fireplace. 5 young servicemen stood beside a river patrol boat. Sunburned. Laughing. Alive. The picture had been taken more than 50 years earlier. Yet Russell could still remember every name, every voice, every face. Especially one. His gaze lingered on the young medic standing near the center of the photograph. The memory tightened something deep inside his chest. Russell looked away. Some wounds never fully healed. He reached over and switched off the radio. The cabin became silent again. But that night, for reasons he couldn't explain, sleep refused to come. Across the lake, Mason Cole slept beneath layers of army blankets inside his pickup truck. Shadow lay curled beside him. The old German shepherd's ears suddenly twitched. His eyes opened. For several moments he remained completely still, listening, watching. Then he slowly lifted his head. Outside, the marina sat quiet beneath fresh snow. The abandoned boat rested on its trailer exactly where Mason had left it. Yet something had caught Shadow's attention. The dog stared through the frosted windshield, focused, alert, almost concerned. A low whine escaped his throat. Mason shifted beneath his blankets. "Easy, buddy." Shadow settled down again, but his eyes remained fixed on the boat, as if something inside it had called to him. Morning arrived beneath a sky painted pale silver. Black Pine Lake looked frozen in time. Mason climbed from the truck and stretched his stiff back. Shadow immediately trotted toward the boat. The dog circled it twice, then stopped near the stern. The same spot Mason had examined the night before. The spot with the strange faded marking. Shadow lowered his nose, sniffed, then scratched once against the weathered hull. Mason frowned. "What is it?" Shadow scratched again, harder this time. Mason walked closer. The dog wasn't acting playful. He wasn't chasing scents. He wasn't distracted by wildlife. He seemed focused on something specific, something inside the boat. Mason climbed aboard. The wooden deck groaned beneath his boots. Years of neglect had left everything brittle. Snow covered parts of the interior. The smell of old wood and rust lingered in the air. Shadow jumped aboard beside him. Again, the dog moved directly toward the rear section. Again, he scratched. Again, he whined. Mason crouched beside him. "You're seeing something I don't?" Shadow stared at the floorboards. The answer seemed obvious. Unfortunately, Mason couldn't see anything unusual. The boards looked old, nothing more. Eventually, he shrugged. Maybe later. Shadow wasn't convinced. The German Shepherd remained there long after Mason returned to work. Over the next several days, Mason began cleaning the vessel. The work was exhausting. Rotting boards needed replacement. Rusted bolts refused to move. Paint peeled away in stubborn sheets. The cold made everything harder. But for the first time in months, Mason woke each morning with a purpose. People noticed. Not everyone approved. One afternoon, 2 fishermen watched him work from the dock. "Guy's wasting his time," one muttered. The other laughed. "Boat's older than both of us." Mason ignored them. Years in the military had taught him how to tune out opinions. Shadow, however, occasionally looked up as if silently judging everyone. The dog remained obsessed with the same section of the boat. Every day, without fail. Scratch, sniff, whine. Wait. It became almost routine. One afternoon, Mason sat on the deck eating a sandwich Claire Dawson had given him. Claire owned the diner near Main Street. She was one of the few people in town who treated him like a human being instead of a problem. Shadow sat nearby, not eating, not resting, watching the floorboards. Again. Claire noticed. "He always does that?" "Every day. You check under there?" "Nothing obvious." Claire smiled. "Maybe he's smarter than both of us." Mason looked at Shadow. "Wouldn't surprise me." The dog wagged his tail once, as if pleased with the compliment. Days passed. The restoration slowly progressed. New patches appeared along the hull. Fresh boards replaced damaged sections. The boat remained far from seaworthy, but it no longer looked abandoned. It looked hopeful. Then came the festival. Every February, Black Pine hosted a winter celebration near the town square. Families gathered. Food trucks arrived. Music filled the streets. At sunset, fireworks were launched over the lake. Most people loved them. Mason hated them. The first explosion echoed through town shortly after dark. Boom. The sound rolled across the mountains. Mason froze. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. Another explosion followed, then another. Suddenly, he wasn't standing beside his truck anymore. His heart raced. The air felt wrong. His breathing became shallow. The sounds blurred together. Boom, boom, boom. Flashes illuminated the sky. For everyone else, they were fireworks. For Mason, they became something else. Something older. Something darker. The nightmare returned while he was awake. His hands trembled. His vision narrowed. He backed against the truck, trying to breathe, trying to focus, trying to remember where he was. But memories were crashing into reality. The noise, the flashes, the confusion. For several terrifying moments, he couldn't separate one from the other. Then Shadow appeared. The dog moved instantly, without hesitation, without fear. He pressed his body against Mason's legs, firm, steady, present. A low, reassuring whine escaped his throat. Mason looked down. Shadow. Not the past. Not the nightmare. Shadow. The German shepherd nudged his hand, again and again, grounding him, bringing him back. Slowly, the panic began to loosen its grip. The fireworks continued overhead, but now Mason could hear the lake, the wind, the dogs breathing. Reality returned one piece at a time. Several minutes later, he sank onto the tailgate, exhausted. Shadow rested his head on Mason's knee. Neither moved. Neither needed words. The bond between them had been forged years earlier, under circumstances neither would ever forget. Moments like this reminded Mason why he trusted the dog more than most people. You saved me again. Shadow blinked. The dog seemed content simply being there, as if no explanation was necessary. Late that night, long after the fireworks ended, Mason walked down to the marina. Snowflakes drifted through the darkness. The lake reflected the moonlight. Everything felt calm again. Shadow trotted ahead. The moment they reached the boat, the dog's behavior changed. His ears stood upright. His body stiffened. Then he ran directly toward the rear deck. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound echoed through the quiet marina. Mason stared. Even after everything that had happened, Shadow still cared about the same spot, the same floorboards, the same section of the boat, the same mystery. Mason climbed aboard carrying a flashlight. The beam swept across the weathered interior. Nothing. Just old wood, old nails, old memories. Yet Shadow refused to stop. The German shepherd scratched harder than ever before. A loose board rattled slightly beneath his paws. Mason froze. The movement was small, almost impossible to notice. But it was there. He crouched down, ran his hand across the boards. One section felt different, not broken, not damaged. Different. Like it had once been removed. His pulse quickened. Shadow immediately sat beside him, watching, waiting, almost as if he knew. Mason stared into the darkness beneath the flashlight beam. The mystery surrounding the boat suddenly felt larger than ever. And somewhere across Black Pine Lake, in a cabin overlooking the frozen water, Russell Granger sat awake in the middle of the night. Unable to explain why. Unable to sleep. Unable to shake the feeling that something buried long ago was beginning to surface. Neither man knew it yet. But the boat had already started bringing the past back to life. And Shadow had just uncovered the first crack in a secret that had been hidden for more than 50 years. The next morning arrived beneath a sky streaked with pale orange and silver. Black Pine Lake lay perfectly still. Thin ribbons of fog drifted across the water, while sunlight slowly touched the snow-covered mountains beyond the shoreline. Mason hadn't slept much. The loose floorboard occupied his thoughts all night. Several times he had considered returning with tools and tearing the section apart immediately, but something told him to wait. The boat had been hiding its secrets for decades. Another few hours wouldn't matter. Shadow, however, clearly disagreed. The German shepherd stood beside the stern before sunrise, staring at the exact spot beneath the rear deck. Waiting, watching, almost impatient. "You really want me to open that thing, don't you?" Mason asked. Shadow's tail thumped once. Mason laughed quietly. "Thought so." The morning passed with slow progress. Mason scraped paint, removed rusted hardware, replaced several cracked boards along the gunnel, yet every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the mysterious section near the stern. By noon, he finally gave in. He gathered a pry bar, screwdriver, and flashlight. Shadow immediately stood up. The dog seemed to know exactly what was happening. Mason knelt beside the board. Years of dirt and weather had sealed everything together. The screws were barely recognizable beneath rust. Carefully, he began removing them. One, then another, then another. The process took nearly an hour. Finally, the board shifted slightly. A narrow gap appeared. Mason stopped. His pulse quickened. Shadow stepped closer. The dog stared into the opening. Mason slowly lifted the board. Nothing. At least nothing obvious. Only darkness, a hollow space beneath the deck, much larger than he expected. He shined the flashlight inside. The beam swept across old wood and empty compartments. Dust, cobwebs, debris. No treasure, no documents, no answers. Yet something felt strange. The compartment didn't look original. Someone had modified it long ago, built it intentionally, as if the space had once served a purpose. Mason studied it for several minutes. Then he carefully replaced the board. Whatever the answer was, he hadn't found it yet. But the discovery confirmed one thing. Shadow had been right. Again. That afternoon, the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains. A cold wind swept across the lake. The marina became nearly deserted. Most people headed indoors. Mason stayed. He worked until his hands ached. The physical labor helped silence the thoughts that constantly circled through his mind. Memories. Regrets. Questions. Some days the work kept them away. Some days it didn't. As evening approached, a pickup truck rolled slowly into the marina parking lot. The vehicle looked almost as old as Mason's. Its paint had faded years ago. Its tires crunched across the snow-covered gravel. The truck stopped. The driver's door opened. An elderly man stepped out. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone carrying invisible weight. A heavy green coat covered his thin frame. A wool cap shaded his face. For several seconds, he simply stood there, looking at the boat. Not Mason, not Shadow. The boat, something changed in his expression immediately. The color seemed to drain from his face. His eyes widened, then narrowed. The reaction was impossible to miss. Mason straightened. The old man began walking toward the vessel, one slow step at a time. His boots left deep impressions in the snow. Shadow stood, alert, not aggressive, just watchful. The elderly stranger stopped beside the trailer. His gaze traveled along the hull, across the repaired boards, over the faded paint. Finally, his hand reached out. His fingers touched the wood. The gesture looked less like curiosity and more like recognition, like greeting an old friend or an old ghost. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved across the lake. The marina creaked softly. Somewhere overhead, a raven called from a pine tree. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was rough with age. "You bought her." It wasn't a question. Mason nodded. "About a week ago." The man continued staring at the boat. "I never thought I'd see her again." A chill ran through Mason. Something about the way he said it felt important, personal. "You know this boat?" The old man remained silent. His eyes moved slowly across the weathered hull. Then he smiled. Not with happiness. With memory. Know her? His voice almost broke. "I spent months on her." Mason felt his attention sharpen immediately. "Who are you?" The old man finally looked at him. Russell Granger. The name meant nothing to Mason, but the emotion behind it did. Russell turned back toward the vessel. The years weren't kind to her. No. But she's still here. Mason glanced at Shadow. The dog hadn't moved. His eyes remained fixed on Russell, studying him, evaluating him. Russell noticed. Beautiful dog. He was military. Russell nodded slowly. So was I. The words settled between them. Neither man needed further explanation. Veterans often recognized one another without saying much. The posture, the eyes, the scars that couldn't be seen. What branch? Russell asked. Navy. Russell nodded. Figured. Mason smiled slightly. What gave it away? You look at everything before you trust it. For the first time, Russell smiled, a genuine smile. Then his attention shifted back to the boat. The smile disappeared. What was her name? Mason asked. Russell's expression changed instantly. His eyes became distant. Traveling somewhere far beyond Black Pine Lake, far beyond Montana, far beyond the present. The Sparrow. The name hung in the cold air. The Sparrow? Russell nodded. That's what we called her. Mason looked at the hull. For some reason, hearing the boat's name made it feel alive. More than scrap, more than lumber. A vessel with a history. A story. Russell slowly climbed onto the trailer. His movements were careful, reverent, like visiting sacred ground. His hand moved along the railing, over the deck, across scars left by decades of weather. I was 24 when I first stepped aboard her. Mason listened quietly. The old veteran's voice grew softer. We were kids. He laughed sadly. Thought we knew everything. The lake wind tugged at his coat. We were assigned to a river patrol unit. Mason noticed the way Russell chose his words, carefully, like someone stepping around broken glass. There were 5 of us. The old man paused. His eyes settled on a distant point beyond the lake. 5. The number immediately caught Mason's attention. He remembered the strange feeling he'd experienced when first seeing the boat, the faded military marking, the hidden compartment. Now this. 5 servicemen. The story was growing. What happened to them? Mason asked. Russell remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered. Life. The response sounded incomplete, like only part of the truth. Mason sensed it immediately. Russell continued. There was Danny. A faint smile appeared. He could fix anything. Another pause. Frank was always telling jokes. His smile faded. Tom hated mornings. The old man laughed softly. Then the laughter disappeared. His expression hardened. One final name remained. Mason could feel it. Russell looked away. Toward the mountains. Toward the water. Anywhere except the boat. Or Mason, who was the 5th? Mason asked. The question seemed simple, yet Russell's reaction was immediate. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. Even Shadow noticed. The German shepherd slowly stood, watching, waiting. Russell swallowed. For the first time, genuine pain appeared in his eyes. A deep wound, an old wound, the kind time never fully healed. Owen Mercer. The name emerged almost as a whisper. Then silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable, meaningful. Mason waited. Russell didn't continue. Instead, he stepped off the trailer, suddenly looking older than before. much older. "What happened to Owen?" Mason finally asked. Russell's face drained of color. His eyes locked onto the boat, then onto the lake, then somewhere far away, no. His voice was quiet, firm, final. "I can't talk about that." The answer surprised Mason, not because of what Russell said, because of how he said it. The reaction wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was guilt. Deep guilt. The kind a man carries for decades. Russell took a step backward, then another, as if the boat itself had become too much to face. "I should go, Russell." But the old veteran was already turning away, heading toward his truck. His movements hurried now, uneasy, almost desperate. Before climbing inside, he stopped. One final glance toward the vessel, toward the Sparrow, toward the memories it carried. Then he looked directly at Mason, for the first time. "If that boat is talking to you..." He hesitated. His eyes briefly found Shadow. "Listen." Without another word, he climbed into the truck. The engine started. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the snowy road, leaving only silence behind. Mason stood beside the boat, trying to process everything he had learned. The Sparrow, 5 servicemen, a hidden compartment, and a man named Owen Mercer. A name that still haunted someone after more than 50 years. Beside him, Shadow slowly walked back to the stern. Back to the same loose floorboard, the same mystery. The dog lowered his nose, sniffed once, then looked directly at Mason, as if reminding him that whatever answer Russell couldn't bring himself to say was still hidden somewhere inside the boat. Waiting. The words lingered in Mason's mind long after Russell Granger's truck disappeared down the snowy road. The marina grew quiet again. Only the wind remained. It moved across Black Pine Lake in slow, cold waves, carrying tiny crystals of snow through the air. Mason stood beside the Sparrow and stared at the loose floorboard near the stern. Shadow sat beside it, watching, patient, certain. The dog had been trying to show him something for days, maybe weeks. Now Mason finally understood. The answer wasn't on the surface. It was underneath. "All right, partner," Mason said quietly. "Let's see what you've been trying to tell me." The German shepherd immediately stood. His tail wagged once. Mason grabbed a toolbox from the truck. The metal latch snapped open in the cold air. He collected a pry bar, flashlight, hammer, and work gloves before returning to the boat. The winter sun was already dropping behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the marina. The lake reflected the fading light like polished steel. Mason climbed aboard. The Sparrow groaned softly beneath his weight. Every board seemed to carry a memory. Every nail seemed connected to a story he still didn't understand. Shadow jumped aboard beside him. The dog walked directly to the stern. Again. Always the same place. Mason knelt. This time he intended to go deeper. Carefully, he removed several additional boards surrounding the loose section. The work was slow. The wood was old and brittle. Years of moisture had fused parts of the structure together. By the time darkness settled over the lake, a large section of the deck had been exposed. Mason switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Below him sat a hidden cavity larger than he'd first realized. The compartment extended farther beneath the floor than seemed necessary, farther than any normal storage space. Shadow lowered his nose, sniffed, then suddenly began pawing at the far corner. Hard, aggressive, focused. The sound echoed through the hollow interior. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Mason crawled closer. His flashlight followed the dog's paws. At first, he saw nothing. Then something caught the light. Metal. Very faint. Almost completely hidden beneath decades of dirt and debris. His heartbeat quickened. He reached inside. The object wouldn't move. It was wedged tightly beneath a support beam. Mason grabbed a small shovel from his tools and carefully cleared away years of compacted dirt. Little by little, the shape emerged. A box. Small, rectangular, metal, old, very old. The surface was covered in rust. One corner had nearly corroded away completely. For a moment, neither Mason nor Shadow moved. The discovery felt strangely sacred, like opening a door into another life, another time, another world. Finally, Mason lifted the box free. It was surprisingly heavy. The metal groaned softly as he set it on the deck. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from anticipation. Questions flooded his mind. Who put it there? Why hide it? Why had it remained untouched for so long? Most importantly, was this connected to Owen Mercer? The name surfaced again. The same name that had transformed Russell's face. The same name attached to decades of guilt. The same name Shadow had unknowingly been leading him toward. Snow began falling as Mason studied the box. Large flakes drifted silently through the darkness. The marina lights reflected off the lake. Everything felt strangely still, as though the world itself were waiting. The lock had long ago rusted shut. Mason carried the box to his workbench near the marina storage shed. Shadow followed closely. The German shepherd never took his eyes off it. Mason positioned the box beneath a hanging work lamp. Yellow light illuminated the corroded metal. The years had not been kind. Rust covered nearly every surface, but one small detail remained visible, a faded military stencil, almost impossible to read, yet still there. Mason leaned closer. The letters were worn, incomplete, but enough remained to make out a few characters. US, the rest had vanished beneath time. Mason swallowed. His pulse accelerated. The box was military. The Sparrow wasn't merely an old boat. Russell had been telling the truth. The vessel had once belonged to servicemen. Real servicemen. Real missions. Real history. Slowly, Mason reached for a hammer. One strike. The rusted lock cracked. A second strike. The latch broke free. The sound echoed through the empty marina. For several seconds, Mason simply stared. The box sat open, waiting. Shadow sat beside him, perfectly still. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, 50 years of silence prepared to end. Mason lifted the lid. The hinges protested loudly. A cloud of dust drifted into the air. Then the contents appeared. His breath caught. Inside lay several carefully preserved objects. Not treasure, something far more valuable. History. A pair of military dog tags rested on top. Beneath them sat several photographs bundled together with fading twine. And underneath everything, a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were brittle, but somehow it had survived, protected, hidden, waiting. Mason carefully lifted the dog tags first. The metal felt cold in his hand. The engraving remained surprisingly clear. He turned them toward the light. His eyes widened. The name was unmistakable. Owen Mercer. For a moment, the marina seemed to disappear. The mountains, the snow, the lake. Everything faded. Only the name remained. The same name Russell couldn't discuss. The same name connected to the Sparrow. The same name hidden beneath the deck for half a century. Shadow let out a soft whine, almost as if he sensed the significance. Mason looked down at the dog. Good boy. His voice barely rose above a whisper. You found him. Next came the photographs. Carefully he untied the twine. The images were faded but recognizable. Young men, military uniforms, riverbanks, boats, smiles, lives frozen in time. One photograph immediately stood out. 5 servicemen stood beside the Sparrow. Exactly 5. One of them looked remarkably like a young Russell Granger. The resemblance was unmistakable. Another stood beside him. Tall, lean, friendly smile, medical insignia on his uniform. Mason didn't need anyone to identify him. He knew. Owen Mercer, the man whose name had survived 50 years beneath the floorboards. The man Russell could not forget. The man whose story refused to stay buried. Mason carefully set the photographs aside. Only the envelope remained. The paper crackled softly as he lifted it. His heart pounded. The envelope was sealed, unopened. Waiting all these years. On the front, written in faded blue ink, were 4 words. For Russell Granger. Mason stared at the handwriting. Everything suddenly made sense. The hidden compartment, the box, the secrecy, the guilt. This letter had never reached its destination. 50 years earlier, someone had hidden it beneath the floorboards, and nobody had ever found it. Until Shadow. The realization sent chills through Mason. The German shepherd sat quietly beside him. Snow drifted beyond the workshop windows. The lake lay silent in the darkness. And somewhere across Black Pine Lake, inside a lonely cabin overlooking the frozen water, Russell Granger had no idea that the past had finally found its way back to him. Mason looked once more at the envelope, then at Owen's dog tags, then at the photographs. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. Tomorrow he would find Russell. Tomorrow he would hand him the letter. Tomorrow a secret hidden for more than 50 years would finally be opened, and neither man was prepared for what waited inside. Mason barely slept. The sealed envelope sat on the passenger seat of his truck, illuminated occasionally by passing moonlight. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself looking at the faded handwriting again. For Russell Granger. 50 years, 5 decades of silence, 5 decades of waiting. Outside, snow continued falling across Black Pine Lake. Inside the truck, Shadow slept with his head resting near the envelope, as if guarding it. The sight wasn't lost on Mason. The old German shepherd had found the hidden compartment, found the metal box, found Owen Mercer. Now it felt as though the dog intended to protect the final piece of the puzzle, too. Just before dawn, Mason started the truck. The engine groaned before finally coming alive. Snow covered the roads leading into the mountains. A pale winter sun slowly emerged behind the peaks as Mason drove toward the cabin Russell had described. The road twisted through dense pine forest. Branches sagged beneath fresh snow. The deeper they climbed, the quieter the world became. Eventually, Mason spotted the cabin. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. The structure sat alone overlooking the frozen lake below. A place built for solitude, a place where a man could hide from memories. Mason parked. Shadow jumped out first. The dog paused, sniffing the cold air before following Mason toward the porch. Before Mason could knock, the door opened. Russell stood there. For a moment, neither man spoke. The old veteran's eyes immediately dropped to the envelope in Mason's hand. The color drained from his face. "Where did you find that?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. Mason held it carefully. "Inside the boat." Russell looked as though the world had suddenly tilted beneath him. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The cabin smelled of cedar, coffee, and wood smoke. Military photographs lined the walls. Mason noticed more pictures than before. Boats, Riverbanks. Young men in uniform. A life preserved in frames. Russell sat heavily at the kitchen table. Shadow settled beside the stove. The old dog watched quietly, waiting. Russell stared at the envelope. His hands trembled. Not from age, from something deeper. Fear, hope, grief. Maybe all three. I never got a letter from Owen. The old veteran swallowed hard. I always thought if there was one, it got lost. Mason carefully placed it on the table. It found its way home. Russell closed his eyes. For several moments he said nothing. Then he reached for the envelope. His fingers hesitated before touching it, as if he feared it might disappear. Or worse, as if he feared what it might contain. The room became silent. Only the crackling fire could be heard. Outside, wind brushed against the cabin walls. Russell finally broke the seal. The paper cracked softly, a sound no one had heard in half a century. Slowly he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was faded but readable. Russell's eyes moved across the first lines. Immediately, his expression changed. Pain, memory, love, loss, all of it surfaced at once. Mason remained silent. Some moments belonged to the people living them, not the people watching. Russell began reading aloud. Russ. His voice faltered. He cleared his throat, then started again. Russ, if you're reading this, then something happened that neither of us expected. The room seemed to shrink. Even Shadow lifted his head. I know you. You're probably angry I hid this letter. But if you're holding it, then it means the sparrow survived longer than either of us. Russell paused. A faint smile appeared. Owen always called her the sparrow. His eyes returned to the page. You always said boats remember things. I laughed at you for it. Maybe I shouldn't have. A tear slipped down Russell's cheek. He kept reading. If things go bad, and I don't make it home, promise me something. Don't carry me around forever. The old veteran stopped. His shoulders tightened. Mason could see the struggle, the years, the guilt, the weight. Russell continued. Don't spend your life wondering what you could have done differently. Don't waste years replaying decisions nobody can change. The old man's voice began to crack. Mason felt his own throat tighten. Because suddenly, it wasn't only Russell hearing those words. It was him too. A former SEAL who carried his own ghosts, his own regrets, his own names. The letter continued. If you're reading this, then we're both older than we ever thought we'd be. Russell laughed softly through tears. Owen was wrong about that one. Then he kept reading. You were always trying to protect everyone. That's who you are. But some things aren't yours to carry. Silence filled the cabin. The words seemed almost impossible, as if Owen had somehow known exactly what Russell would become, exactly what burden he would spend decades carrying. Russell's hands shook harder. He turned the page. The next section changed everything. If something happens to me, there is still one truth left inside her. Russell froze. Mason leaned forward. The truth. The same words Owen had mentioned before. The same mystery. The same unfinished promise. The room suddenly felt colder. Russell continued reading. I couldn't tell anyone back then. Not officially. Not while certain people were still protecting themselves. Mason exchanged a glance with Shadow. The dog remained still, watching, listening. The letter continued. What happened on the river wasn't the whole story. Russell's breathing became uneven. His eyes widened. For the first time, genuine shock appeared on his face. Owen, he whispered. Then he read further. If you're reading this, then someone finally found what I left behind. They'll know where to look. Russell lowered the paper. His expression was one Mason had never seen before. Not grief, not sadness. Recognition. The look of someone remembering something forgotten, something buried, something avoided. You know what he's talking about? Mason's voice was quiet. Russell stared into the fire. For nearly a minute, he didn't answer. Then he nodded. Slowly. Reluctantly. I think I do. The admission hung in the air. Mason felt his pulse quicken. What happened? Russell looked toward one of the old photographs hanging near the fireplace. The picture of 5 young servicemen beside the Sparrow. His eyes settled on Owen. We were told a story. He swallowed. The official story. And? Russell's jaw tightened, and there were parts that never made sense. The old veteran stood and walked toward the window. Snow drifted outside. The frozen lake stretched beneath the mountains, a world untouched by time. I spent 50 years trying not to think about those questions. His reflection stared back from the glass. Now Owen's asking me to face them. Mason looked down at the letter. There was one final paragraph. Russell returned to the table. Carefully, he read it. If someone finds this after all these years, tell them the Sparrow deserves better than being forgotten. So do the men who sailed her. A long silence followed. Then the final sentence. The sentence that stopped both men cold. The truth is still hidden inside her. Russell lowered the letter. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. Because the mystery wasn't over. It had only grown larger. The box hadn't contained answers. It had contained directions. Somewhere inside the Sparrow, something else remained hidden. Something important enough for Owen Mercer to risk everything protecting it. Something important enough to hide for 50 years. And now both men understood. The letter had never been the destination. It was only the beginning. Outside the cabin window, clouds gathered over the mountains. The wind began to rise. And beside the stove, Shadow slowly lifted his head, as if he already knew the boat wasn't finished revealing its secrets. Not even close. The storm arrived during the night. By sunrise, Black Pine Lake had disappeared behind curtains of snow and fog. Wind swept across the frozen shoreline, rattling dock chains and whistling through the empty marina. Mason stood inside the small workshop beside the Sparrow, staring at Owen Mercer's letter spread across the workbench. The words had followed him home from Russell's cabin. The truth is still hidden inside her. He had read the sentence at least 20 times. Each reading raised more questions. What truth? What had Owen been protecting? And why had he hidden it inside the boat? Shadow lay nearby, stretched across a patch of sunlight that managed to slip through the workshop window. For the first time in days, the German shepherd appeared calm, as though discovering the letter had only completed one part of a much larger mission. Mason folded the pages carefully and returned them to a protective folder. Then he looked toward the Sparrow. The old vessel sat beneath hanging work lights. Its damaged hull no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive, like something slowly waking up. And someone else had noticed. Outside, a black luxury SUV rolled into the marina parking lot. The vehicle looked completely out of place among the aging fishing trucks and snow-covered trailers. Its polished paint reflected the winter sky. Its tires barely made a sound on the gravel. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. Expensive coat, expensive boots, expensive watch. The kind of man who looked comfortable giving orders, not receiving them. Shadow's head immediately lifted. The dog's ears stood upright. A low growl emerged from deep in his chest. Mason noticed. That alone was unusual. Shadow rarely disliked people without reason. The man approached confidently. His eyes traveled over the sparrow before finally settling on Mason. "You Mason Cole?" "Depends who's asking." The man smiled. Not warmly. Professionally. "I'm Victor Hale." The name meant nothing to Mason. At least not yet. Victor extended a hand. Mason shook it. The grip felt calculated, controlled. The handshake of someone accustomed to negotiations. "I've heard a lot about you." Mason glanced toward the boat. "That can't be very interesting." Victor chuckled. "Actually, it is." His eyes returned to the sparrow. "The whole town is talking about this restoration project." Mason said nothing. Something about the conversation already felt wrong. Victor slowly walked around the vessel, studying it, evaluating it, like a businessman inspecting inventory, not a person admiring history. "Interesting boat." "It is. Expensive hobby." Mason shrugged. "I've had worse." Victor stopped beside the stern, near the area where Shadow had discovered the hidden compartment. The dog's growl deepened. Victor noticed. "Your dog doesn't like me. Shadow usually has good instincts." The comment landed exactly where Mason intended. Victor smiled anyway. But this time the smile looked thinner, less genuine. "I'll get right to the point." There it was. The real reason he came. Victor slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "I'd like to buy the boat." Mason stared at him. For a moment he thought he had misheard. "Buy it?" That's right. The marina developer looked completely serious. "How much?" Mason crossed his arms. "It isn't for sale." Victor's smile faded slightly. "You don't even know my offer." "I don't need to." For several seconds, neither man spoke. The wind howled outside. Snow tapped softly against the workshop windows. Finally, Victor sighed. "I'll make this simple." He named a number. A large number. Much larger than the $1,000 Mason had spent. Enough money to change his situation overnight. Enough to buy an apartment. Enough to stop sleeping in a truck. Enough to make most people say yes immediately. Victor clearly expected exactly that. Instead, Mason shook his head. "No." The developer blinked. "No. Not interested." Victor studied him carefully, as though searching for a weakness. "There has to be a number." "There isn't." The answer seemed to genuinely surprise him. Most people had a price. Victor Hale built his career on that belief. The idea that someone would refuse easy money clearly bothered him. His gaze drifted toward the sparrow again. For the first time, Mason noticed something unusual. Victor wasn't looking at the boat with admiration or curiosity. He was looking at it with concern, almost anxiety. The realization immediately raised Mason's suspicions. Why would a wealthy developer care so much about one forgotten boat? Victor forced another smile. "Think about it." "I already did." The developer's expression hardened, only slightly, but enough. Then he turned and walked away. Halfway to his SUV, he stopped. One final glance toward the vessel. One final look at Mason. Then he left. The moment the SUV disappeared, Shadow stopped growling. The silence felt significant. Mason watched the road for several seconds. Something wasn't right. Not even close. Later that afternoon, he found himself sitting inside Claire Dawson's diner. The warmth felt good after hours in the cold. The diner overlooked Main Street. Its windows glowed with golden light. Country music played softly from an old speaker. The smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the air. Claire approached carrying a steaming mug. You look like you've been solving mysteries. Mason laughed. Do I? You have that look. She sat across from him. What happened? Mason hesitated, then told her about Victor Hale. The offer, the money, the strange behavior. Claire listened carefully. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. That doesn't surprise me. Mason frowned. You know him. Everybody knows him. Her tone immediately changed. Not anger. Not exactly. More like distrust. He owns half the development projects around here. Mason sipped his coffee. And? And he doesn't usually care about old boats. The answer confirmed his suspicions. Claire lowered her voice. Victor only gets interested in something when he thinks it affects his plans. What plans? The marina expansion. Mason's eyes narrowed. Claire continued. He's been trying to buy more shoreline property for years. The pieces began connecting. Slowly. Uncomfortably. You think this is about real estate? I don't know. She glanced toward the snowy street outside. But I know one thing. What? If Victor Hale suddenly wants your boat, there's a reason. The statement lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, Mason returned to the marina. The storm had finally passed. The lake reflected moonlight beneath a clear sky. Everything felt quiet, almost peaceful. Yet an uneasy feeling followed him. The Sparrow sat exactly where he had left it. Shadow immediately climbed aboard. The dog made his usual inspection. Then something unexpected happened. Near the bow, Shadow stopped. His posture stiffened, his ears rose, a low growl escaped his throat. Mason grabbed his flashlight. What is it? The beam swept across the deck. Nothing. Then he noticed it. Fresh footprints. Someone had been there. Recently. Very recently. The snow preserved every detail. The tracks circled the boat, paused near the stern, then disappeared toward the parking lot. Mason felt his stomach tighten. The prints hadn't been there earlier. Someone had visited the Sparrow after dark. Someone interested enough to return secretly. Someone who knew exactly where to look. Shadow continued staring toward the darkness beyond the marina, watching, listening, protecting. Mason slowly turned off the flashlight. The lake stretched before him, silent, beautiful, dangerously quiet. And for the first time since buying the Sparrow, he realized something important. The boat wasn't just uncovering history. Someone was afraid of what that history might reveal, and whoever it was had just made their first move. Mason didn't sleep much that night. The fresh footprints around the Sparrow stayed in his mind long after the marina fell silent. From the driver's seat of his pickup, he watched the boat through the darkness. Snow reflected pale moonlight across the shoreline. The mountains stood like black walls against the stars. Shadow lay awake beside him. The German shepherd rarely barked, rarely reacted without reason. But several times during the night, the dog lifted his head and stared toward the marina, listening, watching, waiting. Around 2 a.m, Mason finally drifted into a light sleep. The nightmare came almost immediately. The sound of rushing water, voices on a radio, someone calling for help, then smoke. Thick smoke, dark smoke. Suddenly Shadow exploded into motion. The German shepherd slammed both front paws against Mason's chest. A sharp bark shattered the nightmare. Mason's eyes snapped open. For one confused second, he thought he was still dreaming. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Real smoke. His pulse surged. Outside the windshield, an orange glow flickered against the darkness. The marina. The Sparrow. Oh no. Mason threw open the truck door. Cold air hit his face. Shadow was already sprinting toward the shoreline. The glow intensified. Then Mason saw flames. Fire danced near the storage sheds beside the marina. Bright. Hungry. Dangerous. Wind carried sparks through the darkness. One gust sent burning embers directly toward the Sparrow. Mason ran. His boots pounded across frozen ground. Every instinct from years of military service returned instantly. Assess, move, act, no hesitation. The fire wasn't enormous yet, but it was spreading fast. Dry wood stacked beside one of the maintenance buildings had ignited. Flames climbed the wall. Smoke rolled into the night sky. The Sparrow sat less than 30 yards away, far too close. Shadow reached the scene first. The dog barked furiously. Not at the flames, at something else. Mason followed the sound. For a brief moment he caught movement near the edge of the parking lot. A dark figure. Running. The person disappeared into the darkness before Mason could react. Gone. But the message was clear. This wasn't an accident. The fire had been set. A burst of wind suddenly showered sparks toward the boat. Several landed on the old canvas covering part of the deck. Tiny flames appeared, then spread. Mason's stomach dropped. No. He grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher mounted beside the dock office. The cylinder felt heavy in his hands. He pulled the pin and unleashed a cloud of suppressant across the deck. White powder exploded through the air. The small flames died immediately, but the larger fire continued growing behind him. The maintenance shed groaned as heat intensified. Shadow barked again. The dog had moved behind the building. Mason rounded the corner. His heart nearly stopped. A propane tank sat against the rear wall, only feet from the flames. If the fire reached it, the entire marina could be destroyed. Mason sprinted forward. Heat blasted against his face. Smoke burned his eyes. The tank was heavier than expected. He wrapped both arms around it and pulled. Nothing. The metal refused to move. Years of use had partially frozen it to the ground. The flames climbed higher. The wind strengthened. Time was running out. Then Shadow appeared beside him. The German shepherd barked sharply. Once, twice. The sound cut through the chaos. Focused. Urgent. Mason took a breath. Reset. Tried again. This time the tank shifted. A few inches. Then more. Finally it broke free. Mason dragged it across the snow. Farther. Farther. Far enough. He collapsed to one knee, breathing hard. The fire continued roaring behind him. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Someone had finally called emergency services. Relief washed through him. Then came a crash. A section of the burning shed roof collapsed. Flaming debris scattered across the ground. One large beam tumbled directly toward Mason. Everything happened too fast. He saw it falling, but had no time to move. Shadow did. The German shepherd launched himself forward. The dog slammed into Mason's side with surprising force. Both of them hit the snow. The burning beam crashed exactly where Mason had been standing. Sparks exploded into the air. For several seconds, Mason simply stared. Shock, disbelief. Then he heard a yelp. His head snapped around. Shadow. The dog struggled to stand. One side of his coat was singed. A small burn marked his shoulder. Nothing catastrophic. But enough. Enough to make Mason's chest tighten. Shadow. He immediately moved toward him. The German shepherd wagged his tail weakly, still trying to reassure Mason despite being hurt. The sight nearly broke him. The fire department arrived moments later. Red lights flashed across the snow. Firefighters poured from trucks. Hoses unfurled. Water blasted into the flames. The battle lasted nearly an hour. By dawn, the fire was finally under control. Smoke drifted upward in gray columns. The maintenance shed was destroyed. The marina office suffered damage, but the Sparrow survived. Barely. Mason sat beside the boat wrapped in a blanket. Shadow rested beside him. A local veterinarian had examined the dog. The burns were minor, painful, but treatable. The relief left Mason exhausted. Claire Dawson arrived shortly after sunrise carrying coffee and concern. The moment she saw Shadow, she knelt beside him. "Oh, sweetheart." The dog accepted the attention with quiet dignity. Mason stared toward the blackened remains of the shed. This wasn't random. Claire followed his gaze. "No." The word came from behind them. Mason turned. Russell Granger stood near the dock. The old veteran looked pale, shaken. He had driven down from the mountain as soon as he heard. Russell studied the damage, then the Sparrow, then Mason. What happened? Mason explained everything. The footprints, the fire, the fleeing figure. Russell listened silently. When the story ended, the old man's expression darkened. "They know." Mason frowned. "Who?" Russell looked toward the boat, toward the hidden history buried inside it, toward Owen's unfinished message. "The people who don't want the truth found." The statement hung heavily in the cold morning air. Nobody spoke, because deep down, they all knew he was right. Later that afternoon, the county fire investigator completed his preliminary inspection. The official conclusion came quickly. The fire had not started naturally. An accelerant had been used. Someone had deliberately ignited the structure. Arson. The word spread through Black Pine by evening, and with it came questions. Who would burn part of a marina? Why target an old boat? Why now? Mason already suspected the answer. The timing was too perfect. The fire happened only days after Owen's letter surfaced. Only days after Victor Hale tried to buy the Sparrow. But suspicion wasn't proof. Not yet. As darkness returned to Black Pine Lake, Mason sat aboard the Sparrow beside Shadow. The dog rested his bandaged shoulder against Mason's leg. The lake reflected the first stars of evening. Everything seemed peaceful again. Yet beneath that calm, tension continued building. Someone had crossed a line. Someone was willing to destroy evidence, willing to risk lives, willing to erase history. And despite the danger, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The closer Mason came to Owen Mercer's secret, the more desperate someone became to stop him. And hidden somewhere inside the Sparrow, the next piece of that secret was still waiting to be found. 3 days after the fire, Black Pine Lake looked different. Not because the mountains had changed, not because the snow had melted, but because Mason no longer saw the Sparrow as a restoration project. Now he saw it as evidence. Evidence that someone had worked very hard to hide. Evidence that someone had nearly burned to ashes. The scars from the fire remained visible around the marina. Charred beams, blackened concrete, twisted metal. Yet the old boat remained standing, weathered, damaged, defiant. Much like the men connected to it. The winter sun hung low over the lake as Mason carefully removed another section of damaged flooring near the stern. Shadow rested nearby on a blanket. The veterinarian had ordered limited activity while his shoulder healed. The German shepherd clearly disagreed. Every few minutes he would stand, inspect the boat, and then reluctantly lie back down. Mason smiled. "You never learned how to take it easy." Shadow wagged his tail, then immediately stared toward the boat again. Always watching, always working. Russell arrived shortly after noon. The old veteran climbed onto the dock, carrying a thermos of coffee. The dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. Neither had Mason. Too many questions remained unanswered. Russell handed him a cup. "You find anything?" "Not yet." The old man studied the sparrow. Whatever Owen hid, he didn't want it found by accident. Mason nodded. "That's becoming obvious." For the next several hours they worked together, one restoring, one remembering. Occasionally Russell would point toward a section of the vessel and share another fragment from the past, where equipment had once been stored, where supplies had been secured, where the crew had slept during long nights on the river. Every story seemed to bring him equal parts comfort and pain. Then something unexpected happened. Near sunset, Mason removed a section of fire-damaged interior paneling that had partially separated from the hull. At first he intended only to replace it, nothing more. But when the panel came loose, he noticed something unusual. A narrow gap, barely visible, running behind the inner wall. He froze. The opening didn't belong there, at least not according to the boat's design. Mason grabbed his flashlight. The beam disappeared into darkness. His pulse quickened. "Russell." The old veteran looked up immediately. "What is it?" "I think we found something." Russell moved closer. Even Shadow stood, despite the discomfort in his shoulder. The dog approached slowly, alert, focused, the way he always became when they were near an important discovery. Mason widened the opening. The gap revealed a hidden space concealed between structural supports. Not large, but deliberate. A compartment. Another compartment. Unlike the first one, this wasn't beneath the floor. It was hidden inside the boat itself. Protected behind layers of wood. Protected from weather. Protected from time. Protected from anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The realization sent chills through all three of them. "Owen," Russell whispered. Mason reached inside. His fingertips brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully, he pulled it free. Dust drifted through the air. The package landed softly on the workbench. No one spoke. The lake seemed to fall silent. Even the wind appeared to pause. Slowly, Mason unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay several items: a stack of folded military documents, a waterproof map case, mission logs, navigation charts, and one final sealed packet, much larger than the envelope Owen had left behind. Russell's face turned pale. For several moments he simply stared. Then he sat down heavily on a nearby crate. "What is it?" Mason asked. The old veteran swallowed hard. "I think..." His voice nearly failed him. "I think this is what he was talking about." The mission logs were the first thing Mason examined. Most pages contained coordinates, dates, river patrol routes, routine operational information, nothing extraordinary. Then he found several pages marked differently. Certain entries had been highlighted, certain sections underlined, several names repeated throughout the records. The final mission listed in the logs immediately drew his attention. Russell noticed it too. The old man's breathing slowed. His eyes narrowed. "I remember this." Mason looked up. "What happened?" Russell stared at the faded pages. The years seemed to disappear from his face. For a moment he looked much younger and much more haunted. "The official report said we lost contact during a rescue operation." Mason waited. Russell continued. "That was true." The old veteran pointed toward another section, but this part was never mentioned. Mason followed his finger. There, buried inside handwritten notes, was a description of a second extraction. Unofficial, unreported, unexplained. A mission that appeared nowhere in the official records. Russell looked genuinely shocked. "I've never seen this before." The realization landed heavily. Someone had altered the historical record. Someone had intentionally removed part of what happened. But why? Mason continued reading. The documents became increasingly detailed, more specific, more personal. The further he went, the more obvious it became that Owen Mercer had documented everything, not for military command, for history, for truth. For the day someone finally asked questions. The final packet remained unopened, sitting quietly beside the logs, waiting. Russell stared at it. Mason stared at it. Neither reached for it immediately. Somehow they both understood. Once opened, there would be no going back. The mystery would move closer to its answer. Whatever Owen had spent decades protecting was likely inside. Finally, Russell spoke. "I need to tell you something." Mason looked up. The old veteran's eyes were fixed on the lake. "I haven't been completely honest." The admission hung heavily between them. "What do you mean?" Russell exhaled slowly. The confession clearly hurt. "I told you Owen died." He paused. "I told you I carried guilt." Another pause. Much longer. Then the truth emerged. "I never told you why." The lake reflected the fading orange light of sunset. The mountains stood silent around them. Shadow sat beside Russell now, watching him carefully, almost protectively. The old veteran lowered his head. "When that mission went bad," his voice cracked, "I was the one in command." Mason remained silent. Russell continued. "I gave the order." The words seemed to physically hurt him. Every syllable carried 50 years of regret. "I spent my whole life believing my decision got Owen killed." Silence followed, the kind that only appears when someone finally speaks a truth they've buried for decades. Mason understood that silence. He knew what guilt looked like, what it felt like. Veterans carried many things home. Sometimes memories, sometimes scars, sometimes questions that never stopped asking themselves. Russell looked toward the sealed packet. "If the answer is in there." His voice trembled. "I'm not sure I want to know." Mason studied the old man, then looked at the packet, then at Shadow. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, as if understanding the weight of the moment. The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness settled across Black Pine Lake. The sealed packet sat between them, silent, patient, powerful. Whatever it contained had survived decades. Wars, storms, neglect, fire, and now it was only inches away, closer than ever before. But neither man knew that the truth inside would change everything they believed about Owen Mercer, and everything Russell Granger had blamed himself for during the last 50 years. The sealed packet remained unopened that night. Not because Mason lacked courage, not because Russell lacked curiosity, but because some truths carried weight, and weight demanded respect. The mountains surrounding Black Pine Lake disappeared into darkness as the two men carefully packed away Owen's documents. The lake reflected a sky crowded with stars. The Sparrow sat quietly at the dock, waiting, almost patiently, as though the old boat understood that its final secret would reveal itself soon enough. Russell stood beside the vessel longer than usual before leaving. His weathered hand rested on the railing. His eyes lingered on the deck. The same deck where he had once stood as a young serviceman. The same deck where laughter had echoed across distant rivers. The same deck where memories had begun and ended. "You ever think about how strange life is?" Russell asked quietly. Mason looked up. "Every day." Russell nodded. I spent 50 years trying to forget. His voice drifted away. And now all I want is to remember. The old veteran climbed into his truck and drove toward the mountains. His taillights disappeared among the trees. Mason watched until they were gone. Then he looked down at Shadow. The German shepherd rested beside the dock, his bandaged shoulder healing slowly. You did good, partner. Shadow thumped his tail. Mason smiled, but the smile didn't last. Because something felt wrong. Not outside. Inside. The feeling had followed him for days. A growing pressure. An old weight. PTSD rarely announced itself. Sometimes it arrived like a storm. Sometimes it arrived like fog. Slow, quiet, unavoidable. That night, the fog returned. Mason lay awake in the truck. The sealed packet sat inside a weatherproof case on the passenger seat. He should have felt hopeful. Instead, he felt exhausted. His thoughts drifted toward old missions, old mistakes, old losses, faces he still remembered, names he never forgot. At some point, sleep finally came. The nightmare followed. Water, darkness, radio static, a call for help, then silence. Always silence. Mason woke before dawn. His chest tightened, his breathing uneven. Shadow immediately lifted his head. The dog pressed against him, grounding him, steady, present, real. For several minutes, neither moved. The first sunlight eventually crept over the mountains. Morning arrived, and with it came terrible news. The phone call reached Mason just after 8. Claire Dawson's voice sounded shaken. Mason. Something in her tone made his stomach drop. What happened? It's Russell. The world seemed to stop. Mason stood instantly. What about him? There was an ambulance at his cabin this morning. Fear hit hard, fast, sharp, the same fear veterans often carried when they received unexpected calls, the same fear families knew too well. Is he alive? A pause. Yes. Relief came first, then concern. They took him to St. Joseph's Medical Center. Mason was already grabbing his keys. I'm on my way. The drive felt endless. Snow-covered roads wound through forests and valleys. The mountains stood silent beneath gray skies. Shadow sat beside him the entire time, watching the road, watching Mason. The hospital overlooked the northern edge of town, a modest building surrounded by pine trees and snowbanks. Mason entered through the front doors. The smell of antiseptic and coffee filled the air. A nurse directed him toward the cardiac unit. When he arrived, he found Russell's daughter sitting outside the room. Mason recognized her from the dedication photographs Russell had shown him. She looked exhausted, worried, relieved, all at once. You must be Mason. He nodded. How is he? The woman sighed. Heart attack. The words landed heavily. He survived. Another pause, but it was close. Mason looked through the glass window. Russell lay quietly in bed. Machines monitored his heartbeat. The old veteran suddenly looked fragile, much older than before, much smaller. The sight hurt more than Mason expected, because somewhere along the way, Russell had become more than a stranger, more than a source of information, more than a veteran connected to a mystery. He had become family. The kind veterans often built for themselves, not by blood, by experience, by understanding, by shared scars. Russell slowly opened his eyes. When he saw Mason standing there, a faint smile appeared. Thought I'd scared everybody. His voice was weak, but still carried the same dry humor. Mason stepped closer. You almost did. Russell chuckled softly. The effort clearly exhausted him. For a while they talked about simple things: the weather, the boat, Shadow, anything except what both men were thinking about. Eventually, Russell's daughter excused herself to speak with a doctor. The room became quiet. The old veteran stared toward the window. Snow drifted beyond the glass. Then he finally spoke. "I'm running out of time." Mason immediately shook his head. "No." Russell smiled sadly. "Son, when you're my age, you stop arguing with reality." Silence followed. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. The old veteran looked toward Mason. "The packet." Mason understood immediately. "I have it." Russell nodded. "You need to open it. Together." A faint smile appeared. Together. But even as they agreed, fear lingered beneath the conversation. Because both men understood what the heart attack really represented. The clock was moving. The mystery no longer felt endless. Time had become part of the conflict. Outside the room, Shadow lay quietly beside the hospital bed. Several nurses had already fallen in love with him. One brought him water. Another brought treats. The German shepherd accepted both politely, then returned to his post, watching the door, waiting, protecting. The same way he always had. Later that afternoon, Russell drifted to sleep. The doctors insisted he rest. Mason finally stepped into the hallway. He sat beside Shadow. The dog immediately leaned against him. For a while, neither moved. The hospital windows overlooked Black Pine Lake in the distance. The frozen water glimmered beneath weak winter sunlight. Mason stared at it, thinking, remembering, questioning. The old fear returned. Not fear of danger, fear of loss. He had spent years losing people, friends, teammates, parts of himself. Now he feared losing Russell before the truth emerged, before Owen's story could be completed, before decades of guilt could finally be lifted. Shadow seemed to sense it. The dog placed his head on Mason's knee, a simple gesture, yet powerful, a reminder. Keep going. Don't quit. Not now. Mason rested a hand on the dog's neck, then looked toward Russell's room. The sealed packet remained locked inside his truck. Waiting. Whatever answers it contained would have to come soon, because time was no longer guaranteed. And for the first time since finding the sparrow, Mason realized something deeply unsettling. The greatest threat wasn't Victor Hale. It wasn't the arsonist. It wasn't the hidden secrets. The greatest threat was that the truth might arrive too late. The next morning dawned cold and clear over Black Pine. Fresh snow covered the mountains. Sunlight spilled across the frozen lake like liquid gold. For the first time in days, the wind was calm. Nature seemed peaceful. But inside Mason Cole, a storm still raged. He stood beside his truck in the hospital parking lot, staring at the weatherproof case resting on the passenger seat. Inside lay the final packet. The last piece Owen Mercer had hidden. The last piece of a story that had survived more than 50 years. The last chance to give Russell Granger the answers he deserved. Shadow sat beside him. The aging German shepherd watched quietly. His bandaged shoulder was healing well. The burns had begun to fade. But the dog still moved carefully. Mason crouched beside him. "You ready?" Shadow's tail tapped the snow. The answer was obvious. Together they walked back into the hospital. Russell was awake. Sunlight filled the room. The old veteran looked tired, yet there was something different about him, something calmer. Perhaps because after decades of uncertainty, he finally knew the waiting was almost over. His daughter sat beside the bed. When she saw the case in Mason's hands, She quietly stood. "I'll give you some privacy." Russell nodded gratefully. The door closed. The room became silent. 3 generations occupied that small space. A former Navy SEAL, a Vietnam veteran, and a German shepherd who had unknowingly connected them. Mason placed the case on the table. Neither man spoke immediately. The moment felt too important, too heavy. Finally, Russell broke the silence. "Let's finish this." Mason opened the case. The sealed packet emerged. The paper was yellowed, fragile, yet somehow intact. Protected by Owen's careful planning. Protected by the sparrow. Protected by time itself. Slowly, Mason opened it. The room seemed to shrink around them. Inside were several folded documents, a handwritten statement, military forms, and one envelope marked "Final Report." Russell's breathing slowed, his eyes fixed on the papers. Mason began reading. The first pages described a rescue mission, a dangerous extraction operation deep inside a hostile river system. Most of it matched the official records Russell already knew. Then the details changed. The final pages told a very different story, one that had never appeared in any report, one that had never been made public. Mason continued reading aloud. According to Owen's account, the original extraction had gone wrong. Several wounded soldiers remained trapped. The Sparrow had limited time, limited fuel, limited options. Russell listened carefully. Every word pulled him deeper into the past. Then came the moment that changed everything. The mission commander had ordered an emergency withdrawal, not because of cowardice, not because of failure, because remaining any longer would have risked every life involved. Russell closed his eyes. He remembered the order. He remembered making it. He remembered living with it. For 50 years. The report continued. After the withdrawal order was given, Owen Mercer made a decision nobody else knew about. He volunteered to remain behind temporarily with several wounded soldiers who could not yet be moved. The room became perfectly silent. Mason kept reading. Owen stayed willingly, knowingly, deliberately. He used the remaining time to stabilize the wounded and organize their evacuation. Hours later, another unit successfully reached the area. The soldiers survived. Because of him. Russell stared at the report, his eyes filled with tears. No. The word escaped as a whisper. Mason continued. The final pages contained Owen's own handwritten account. The handwriting matched the letter, matched the hidden documents, matched the man. Then came the sentence that stopped both of them cold. If Russell is reading this someday, tell him he followed the right orders. The old veteran covered his face. His shoulders trembled, years of pain suddenly rising to the surface. Mason continued reading. I never blamed him. Not once. Not for a second. The room disappeared. The mountains disappeared. The hospital disappeared. Only the words remained. For half a century, Russell Granger had carried guilt that never belonged to him. He had believed his command decision caused Owen's death, believed it every day, believed it every night, believed it through marriage, through fatherhood, through retirement, through old age. And now the truth stood before him. Owen had chosen his path, chosen it willingly, chosen it heroically. Not because Russell failed him, because he was saving others. The old veteran broke down completely. Tears streamed down his weathered face. Years of grief poured out all at once. Mason said nothing. Some wounds could only heal in silence. Shadow slowly rose from the floor. Despite his age, despite his injury. The German shepherd walked carefully to Russell's bedside, then rested his head against the old veteran's arm. Russell looked down. His hand found the dog's fur. For several moments he simply sat there, crying, holding on to the dog, holding on to the truth, holding on to a peace he had never thought possible. Eventually, Russell looked back toward the report. There has to be more. Mason nodded. There was. The final page remained unread. Mason unfolded it carefully. A personal note. Written specifically for the future. Written specifically for whoever eventually found it. He read aloud. If you're reading this, then the sparrow survived, and somehow the story survived too. The handwriting felt alive, personal, immediate, as though Owen were speaking directly to them. I hid these records because the truth mattered more than recognition. The men who came home deserved their lives. The families deserved peace. And one day, someone deserved the full story. Russell wiped away tears. The room remained silent. Mason continued. The next sentence hit harder than anything before it. Russ, if you carried guilt all these years, let it go. A broken laugh escaped the old veteran. Half joy, half heartbreak. Owen knew him perfectly. Even then, even decades earlier. The final paragraph followed. Take care of the sparrow. Take care of each other. And if a dog somehow helps uncover all this, buy him a steak. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Mason laughed. A genuine laugh. The first in days. Russell laughed too, even through tears. Shadow wagged his tail, as if he somehow understood. The emotional weight in the room shifted, not gone, never gone, but transformed. The guilt that had defined Russell's life no longer controlled it. The burden had finally found its rightful owner. No one. It belonged to no one. The doctors later described what happened as emotional relief. A release. A healing moment. Perhaps they were right. Because when Russell finally leaned back against the hospital pillow, he looked different. Lighter. Freer. Older. And somehow younger at the same time. The truth had arrived. Not too late. Just in time. As afternoon sunlight filled the room, Mason carefully packed away Owen's documents. The mystery was solved. The secret revealed. The mission completed. Yet another realization slowly emerged. The story was no longer about hidden records, or secret compartments, or forgotten boats. It had become something larger. A story about forgiveness, about loyalty, about memory, and about the people and dogs who refused to let good men be forgotten. Outside the hospital window, Black Pine Lake shimmered beneath the winter sun. The sparrow waited quietly at the marina. For the first time in more than 50 years, its burden had been lifted, and so had Russell Granger's. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Black Pine. The snow still covered the highest peaks, but patches of green had begun to appear along the lower hillsides. Ice that had gripped the shoreline for months started breaking apart beneath warmer sunlight. Spring was coming, and with it came something Mason Cole hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not complete peace. Not the kind that erased old memories, but enough to let him breathe. Enough to let him sleep through most nights without waking to ghosts. Enough to imagine a future. The sparrow stood at the marina looking almost unrecognizable. Weeks of work had transformed her. Fresh paint covered the hull. The damaged decking had been replaced. The railings gleamed beneath the morning sun. Every repair carried a story. Every board carried a memory. Every nail carried purpose. And everywhere Mason looked, he saw shadow. The old German shepherd had been present for every step, every discovery, every setback, every victory. The dog now rested in the sunlight beside the dock, his shoulder fully healed. His muzzle had grown whiter during the long winter, his movements slower. But his eyes remained sharp, still watching, still protecting, still working. Claire Dawson arrived carrying a tray of coffee. The diner owner smiled as she looked at the restored vessel. Hard to believe it's the same boat. Mason leaned against the railing. Sometimes I feel the same way. Claire laughed. About the boat or yourself? Mason didn't answer immediately. The truth was obvious. Both. The past few months had changed him. The homeless veteran who bought a wreck with his last $1,000 felt like a different man now. Not because his circumstances were perfect. He still lived modestly, still struggled with PTSD, still carried scars, but he no longer carried them alone. Black Pine had slowly become home. Russell joined them shortly afterward. The old veteran moved carefully after his heart attack, but there was strength in him again. A lightness that hadn't existed before. The burden Owen had lifted from his shoulders remained gone. Every day he seemed a little freer, a little younger, a little more alive. He walked onto the dock and stopped beside the Sparrow. For several moments he simply stared. Sunlight danced across the water. The mountains reflected perfectly on the lake. The scene looked almost unreal. Finally, Russell smiled. She's beautiful. Mason glanced toward him. You think Owen would approve? Russell laughed softly. Owen would have complained about the paint color. Claire laughed. So he was one of those guys? The worst. The old veteran's eyes filled with warmth. The pain remained, but now it lived beside gratitude. Not guilt. That difference meant everything. The launch was scheduled for sunrise the following Saturday. No reporters, no television crews, no politicians. That was intentional. Mason wanted something simple, something honest. A gathering for the people who truly mattered. The morning arrived beneath a sky painted gold and blue. The lake was perfectly calm. Not a ripple disturbed the water. The mountains stood silent around Black Pine like ancient guardians watching history unfold. A small crowd gathered near the marina. Claire, Russell, Russell's daughter, several local fishermen, a few veterans from neighboring towns, people who had quietly followed the story, people who understood what it meant. The Sparrow sat at the edge of the launch ramp, waiting. Mason stood beside her, one hand resting on the railing, the other on Shadow's neck. The dog looked up at him. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They had walked every step of the journey together. The crowd slowly moved closer. Conversation faded. The lake became silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mason released the final support. The trailer eased backward. The Sparrow began sliding toward the water. Slowly, carefully, almost gracefully. The hull touched the lake, then floated. A collective breath escaped the crowd. The boat rocked gently. For the first time in decades, the Sparrow rested where she belonged, on the water. Russell's eyes filled with tears. He didn't try to hide them. Nobody expected him to. The old veteran stepped closer to the shoreline. The reflection of the boat shimmered beneath the morning sun. Welcome home. His voice barely carried across the water, but everyone heard it. Mason felt something tighten in his chest, then release. Months earlier, he had been sleeping in a truck, lost, angry, broken. Now he stood beside a restored vessel surrounded by people who cared, people who understood, people who stayed. The transformation felt impossible, Yet here it was. Real. The sparrow floated quietly, like a promise fulfilled, like a chapter completed, like a burden released. Russell turned toward Mason. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the old veteran extended his hand. Mason shook it. The gesture lasted longer than usual. Veterans often communicated through silence. This was one of those moments. Finally, Russell spoke. "You didn't just restore a boat." Mason looked toward the water, toward the mountains, toward shadow. "No." He smiled softly. "We restored a story." The old veteran nodded. "Exactly." The crowd eventually dispersed. The morning grew warmer. The lake remained calm. Mason climbed aboard the Sparrow for her first short trip. Not far, just enough. Russell joined him. Claire waved from the dock. Shadow stepped onto the vessel last. His paws moved confidently across the deck, as though he had always belonged there. The engine started. Its low rumble echoed across the water. The Sparrow moved forward, slowly, steadily, proudly. Black Pine Lake opened before them. The shoreline drifted past. Pine forests reflected in the water. Snow-covered peaks towered overhead. The world felt impossibly beautiful. Russell stood near the bow. The wind moved gently through his silver hair. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Perhaps seeing the lake, perhaps seeing another river far away, perhaps seeing old friends. Mason didn't ask. Some memories deserved privacy. The boat glided across the water. No hurry, no pressure, no mystery left to solve. Only peace. For the first time since buying the Sparrow, Mason allowed himself to simply enjoy the moment. No investigations, no hidden compartments, no threats, no fear, just water, sky, friendship, and healing. The emotional storm that had driven their journey finally settled. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. The kind of silence that comes after truth, after forgiveness, after survival. The kind of silence veterans spend years searching for. As the Sparrow crossed the center of Black Pine Lake, the mountains reflected perfectly around her. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire world had stopped moving. And in that perfect stillness, every person aboard understood the same thing. Some stories end with answers. This one ended with peace. Or at least, that's what Mason Cole thought. Summer arrived in Black Pine with long golden evenings and clear blue skies stretching endlessly above the mountains. The snow had vanished from the lower peaks. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. The lake shimmered beneath the sunlight like polished glass. Life moved differently now. Slower, healthier, brighter. Months had passed since the Sparrow returned to the water. Months since Owen Mercer's hidden truth changed everything. Months since Russell Granger finally laid down the burden he had carried for half a century. And somehow, Black Pine had changed too. The story refused to stay local. First it appeared in a regional newspaper, then a veterans magazine. Then a documentary producer reached out asking questions about the old boat and the documents hidden inside her walls. Soon historians began visiting. Veterans arrived from neighboring states. Families connected to forgotten service members contacted Russell and Mason. Letters started appearing in mailboxes. Emails arrived daily. Phone calls followed. The Sparrow had become more than a restored boat. She had become a symbol, a reminder that history could disappear if nobody fought to preserve it, and that healing sometimes arrived decades late. One warm afternoon, Mason stood inside a newly renovated workshop overlooking the marina. The building had once been abandoned. Now it buzzed with life. Veterans worked side by side restoring old equipment, repairing engines, and rebuilding furniture. A sign hung above the entrance. Second Chance Restoration. The name felt appropriate, because second chances had become the foundation of everything. Mason no longer lived in his truck. A small apartment above the workshop overlooked the lake. Simple, modest, enough. Claire often joked that he had become a local celebrity. Mason hated the description. He preferred staying busy, preferred helping others, preferred focusing on the future. Shadow lay beneath a workbench nearby, sleeping. Age had begun catching up with him. His muzzle was almost completely white now, his movements slower, his naps longer, but his eyes remained as intelligent as ever. Whenever veterans visited, they always stopped to greet him first. Not Mason. Shadow. The German Shepherd had quietly become famous, though he seemed completely unaware. One morning, a government vehicle arrived at the marina. 2 historians stepped out, along with a representative from a veterans memorial organization. Russell joined them. Claire arrived carrying coffee. Several townspeople gathered nearby. Something important was happening. Mason could feel it immediately. The lead historian shook his hand. "Mr. Cole, we've completed our review." Mason nodded. The historian smiled. "The Sparrow has officially been approved as a recognized veterans memorial vessel." Applause erupted from the small crowd. Russell lowered his head, emotion visible in his eyes. Claire wiped away tears. Even Mason struggled to respond. The boat that nearly became scrap metal now carried national recognition. Owen's story would survive. So would the stories of the men who served beside him. The historian continued. "There's something else." Mason noticed the smile. A different smile, almost playful. "What?" The historian glanced toward Shadow. The dog was sleeping peacefully beside the dock. The review committee became very interested in how all this began. Several people laughed softly. Mason already knew where this was heading. The historian continued. Every report mentioned the same detail. Now even Russell was smiling. The dog. The crowd laughed. Shadow lifted his head. Confused, the historian looked directly at Mason. Without Shadow, none of the discoveries would have happened. The statement silenced everyone. Because it was true. Every hidden compartment, every clue, every breakthrough, every discovery. They all started with Shadow. The dog found the first loose board. The dog led them to the hidden box. The dog uncovered Owen's letter. The dog saved Mason during the fire. The dog protected Russell. The dog connected every piece of the story. For months, people had praised Mason, praised the restoration, praised the historians, praised the veterans. Yet somehow the true hero remained quietly lying beneath workbenches and dock benches, exactly where he preferred to be. The historian smiled. "Which is why we'd like to recognize him." Mason blinked. "What do you mean?" A small presentation case appeared. Inside rested a custom service medal. The crowd immediately erupted into applause. Russell laughed. Claire cried openly. Shadow looked around in complete confusion. The dog seemed deeply suspicious of becoming the center of attention. A ceremony was scheduled for the following weekend. News spread quickly. By Saturday morning, the marina was filled with visitors, families, veterans, children, reporters. The mountains stood proudly beneath a cloudless sky. The lake reflected sunlight in every direction. The Sparrow floated beside the dock. Beautiful, historic, honored. Yet for once she wasn't the center of attention. A small stage overlooked the water. Mason sat in the front row beside Russell. Shadow rested at their feet. The German Shepherd looked thoroughly unimpressed by the entire situation. Several speakers discussed the restoration, Owen's story, the importance of preserving history. Then came the final presentation. The historian stepped forward. His voice carried across the marina. When we first reviewed this case, we assumed the hero would be the boat. The crowd listened quietly. Then we assumed the hero would be the veteran who restored her. He nodded toward Mason. Then we learned the full story. A smile spread across his face, and we discovered the hero was someone else entirely. The crowd laughed. The historian pointed gently toward Shadow, an aging military working dog who refused to stop looking. Applause thundered across the marina. Shadow immediately looked at Mason, as if asking for instructions. Mason smiled. "It's okay, buddy." The dog remained seated, calm, loyal, exactly as always. The historian approached, carefully kneeling beside him. Then he attached the medal to a custom collar prepared specifically for the occasion. The crowd stood. Every person, veterans, children, families, reporters, all standing, all applauding, for a dog, for a friend, for a hero. Russell wiped tears from his eyes. Claire cried again. Mason felt his throat tighten, because suddenly he realized something. The boat hadn't saved him. The mystery hadn't saved him. The recognition hadn't saved him. Shadow had. Years earlier, long before Black Pine, long before the Sparrow, long before any of this. The dog had remained, through deployments, through nightmares, through homelessness, through loss, through everything. And somehow he was still there, still protecting, still serving, still loving. The ceremony eventually ended. The crowd slowly dispersed. The lake returned to silence. The mountains glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Mason walked to the end of the dock. Shadow followed. Russell watched from a distance, smiling. The Sparrow floated peacefully nearby. Her reflection danced across the water. History preserved, promises fulfilled, truth revealed. Shadow sat beside Mason, the new medal hanging gently from his collar. The dog looked out across Black Pine Lake, completely unaware of how many lives he had changed. Mason rested a hand on his neck. "Good job, partner." Shadow leaned against him, the same way he always had, the same way he always would. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Golden light faded into twilight. Together they sat there, a former Navy SEAL, an aging German shepherd, a restored boat floating quietly behind them. Neither had expected to survive long enough to reach this moment. Yet here they were, looking toward a future that finally felt possible. And as darkness settled across Black Pine Lake, one truth remained clear above all others. The Sparrow carried the story. Owen Mercer carried the sacrifice. Russell Granger carried the memory. But Shadow carried them all home. The end. If this story touched your heart, comment 1 if you believe loyalty can change a life, or 0 if you think true heroes are too often forgotten. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen quietly, and the people, or dogs, who stand by us deserve to be remembered. And if you enjoy stories about honor, perseverance, and second chances, subscribe and join us for the next journey.